Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Word of Faith Fellowship radio program. We're glad you are listening today. Today, I have John and Nancy with me. You're actually going to hear from a miracle today. John actually had COVID in 2021 and was about to die. As a matter of fact, multiple times and for months, it was questionable whether he was going to live. And he was on a ventilator for approximately 4 months. And there was some doctors that even were giving up hope and encouraging John's wife here, Nancy, to just let John go. And Nancy stayed in there and she fought for her husband. And we as a church at the Word of Faith Fellowship prayed for John. And so you are looking at a miracle here. Somebody who was on the ventilator at the edge of death for that long. And you're going to hear God's miracle working power, God's restoring power in his life. John actually, because of the ventilator being on it for so long, actually had to learn how to talk after that, and so his voice is coming back. It's not as strong as it used to be, but it's a miracle that he can talk, and you're going to just hear the amazing story of God's miracle working power. So, John and Nancy, go ahead.
Okay. Well, in September of 2021, John got very sick, and at first it seemed like it was just a cold or the flu, but it didn't go away. We took him for a COVID test, and it was positive. And not long after that, his oxygen would not stay up. I called his doctor, and she said, "You need to get him to the hospital now." So I took him to the hospital. We got to the hospital. He was so sick, he couldn't even get out of the car. Prior to that, just the week before, he was doing construction. He was climbing ladders. He was working on roofs with no problem. I had to go inside the hospital, get a wheelchair, get him in the wheelchair, and take him in. So due to COVID restrictions, I was not allowed to go in with him. So I checked him in, and they took him, they wheeled him through a door. The door shut, and I stood there, and I really wondered at that point if that was the last time I was going to see him.
I thought it was just going for a short time. Thought it would be a little like break that I get a couple of days rest. I had a false sense of peace that everything was going to be okay. That, I'd be there for a couple of days and go home. That it was just nothing more than a bad case of the flu or something. But after about 3 days of being in the hospital, I had a glass window in front of it was a wall. I remember looking out, and a couple of doctors lined up with a couple of nurses facing the room across from me. And they were talking, and they got done, they left. 30 minutes later, they took that person out. They had passed away. About 6 hours later, the same doctors came back and lined up again with the nurses and talked for a little bit. And about 30 minutes later, that person passed. That's when I began to realize things were serious. It wasn't just a little minor thing. It was a very serious thing. And prior to that, I had carelessly done things that I wanted to do. I had a lot of things that were priority over God. At one time I was seeking God in my life and coming out of the things of the world, but I turned from God. And after I saw that, I began to wonder, did I do what God wanted me to do? Did I fulfill my call? Was I seeking God like I needed to? And I put my phone down. I began to ask Jesus to help me. I didn't know if I was going to live or die. I became very concerned about eternity. I began to see the sin in my life. I was living under the law, not in the will of God, coming to know Jesus. I started to get more and more tired. Didn't know at that time, but when your CO2 goes up, what happens is you fall asleep and you just don't wake up. Even though I hadn't gone there for a long time, I called my pastor from Word of Faith Fellowship. The ministers in the whole church began to pray and fight for my life.
So, as John said, when he was at the hospital, his condition continued to worsen. They had him on oxygen. They kept increasing the oxygen. He's still having trouble breathing. So they put a double oxygen. He had the tubes in his nose. They had the mask on his mouth. And it was hard to eat because if he took the mask off, he couldn't breathe. His oxygen would drop. And so it was very, very difficult. But he's still texting me. And I remember they were giving him milkshakes, some protein drinks. You know, that's about all the nourishment he could get at this time. So he would text me what was going on, and I would call the nurses, and he wanted strawberry. So I'd call the nurse, can you get him strawberry? Because he really couldn't talk, you know, can he? So I helped him where I could, you know, but it was, I knew it was getting more and more serious. He was texting our pastor too at the whole time, and we'd stop the whole church service, and everybody would just start praying for him. But as I said, things were just not getting better at this time. And my daughter and I were on a video call with him one night, and he couldn't hardly respond. It was very bad. And the medical people were telling me, they feel like he's giving up, he's getting depressed. But I knew he wasn't, because I said, John, you're going to make it through this. God's going to get you through this. And he said, amen. And I knew he was still fighting, because that's what he always said. So what was really happening was his CO2 level was going up dangerously high. And that night after I talked to him, it went up so high that he became unresponsive. And he was rushed to ICU, and he was put on a ventilator. So I got a call very early in the morning from the hospital, and they told me what happened. So I called our pastor, and it was very, very early in the morning on a Saturday. She had already been up praying, and God had alerted her. So I'm so grateful for our pastor and the ministers in our church who stood with us and fought for his life, because if she hadn't been up praying, I don't know if he would have made it through that night. But God alerted her how serious it was, and she prayed through the night. So at this point, I was still unable to see him. Due to COVID restrictions, we had to wait 10 days after the positive test. So I finally got to see him, and his condition was very bad. He's in ICU. He was on the ventilator, not awake. And so I continued to, go see him. He was not waking up. They took him off all sedation. He's still not waking up. Doctor didn't think he was going to wake up. I had a precious nurse who encouraged me. She said, he's small. He's been on a lot of medication. And I told her, I'm trusting Jesus. We're praying. And she said she's doing the same thing. So 3 days, he finally woke up. And so the hall that he was on, though, everybody was on ventilators. And there was you're used to going to the hospital and you see visitors and you see gifts in the room, but it wasn't like that. I hardly saw any visitors. The waiting rooms, of course, had signs on them, waiting room closed. Nobody had any gifts in the rooms. And the patient, you see one patient in the room one day, the next day they're not there. They weren't going home. No one was recovering. Honestly, it was just a horrifying situation. I didn't know day to day if John was going to live. He had multiple complications. The hospital chaplain's calling me. I knew he was on a list. It was very serious. And it was a stressful time. I was at the hospital almost every day. And I was still working. Of course, we have a daughter, and I was in the ICU all the time, not used to being around that intense medical conditions like that. But I knew it was God's will for me to be in there fighting for his life. And, when we submit to God's will in our life, the grace of God is there to get us through any difficulty. And God was with us. He was allowed one visitor per day. But I was grateful for that because there were a lot of hospitals at the time that were still not allowing any visitors. And he needed that. Those patients needed support. And I was grateful to our family lives a long ways away. And, of course, they were very supportive. They came when they can. They text. They helped us. But we had a group of friends who really became like our they're my brothers, and one was in there every week. Some came on the weekends, and that really helped. Our daughter was a senior, and like I said, I was still working. It was just a lot, and so we were just grateful for what our friends did during that time. And one day, a doctor came by to talk to me. Every time I try to get there in the morning when the doctors would give the updates. And he came by and he said to me, "John is a breath of fresh air." He said, "No other person on this hallway is going to make it. He's the only one with signs that he might survive." And it was a miracle. I knew God did it. And he said, we're going to put a trach in. If you give permission, we're going to put a trach in. Put the ventilator through the trach. And of course I did. He had that procedure. They moved him to another floor. And we were very hopeful, very grateful he was making progress.
Did they explain to you why he was going on the vent? Was this a last resort? Had they tried other things before that?
They did, but the night he became unresponsive, they my understanding, they didn't have any other resort.
Okay.
At that point, I didn't get a call before they put him on a ventilator, but it was an emergency, so they took him right down there and put him on a ventilator.
When he was on the ventilator, was there any way that he would be able to communicate with you?
No, it was down his throat. Other than he really was too weak at that point to write, and other than hand motions, he was not able to communicate. So he was moved to that other floor, but more complications developed. He's starting to lose kidney function. They're trying to get him off the ventilator. They can't get him off the ventilator. And we had a lot of good doctors and nurses who fought for him. But with severe COVID patients, there was an anticipation that they wouldn't make it. And it seemed like it was almost expected by some. And I had one doctor who kept encouraging me to just let him go. And he would tell me I needed to consider the lifestyle that he has. Would my husband really want to live this way? On a ventilator, multiple medical complications, which I knew what he was saying. In other words, that, I'm fighting for him to live, and I really needed to consider that I need to allow them to help him to go, as if that would be a kinder way. But our hope was in Jesus, and we were crying out to God. I knew he didn't want to live that way, but our faith was in God, that he was going to come through it and get better. So it was during this time, I think the end of October, I got a phone call. Our church had a seminar at the time. I was in church. In the hospital, they were very good about calling at scheduled times. I got an update very early in the morning every day and at night. Because he was in ICU, we weren't allowed to call. So they would always call and reassure me, I'm just calling for an update. And I got a call not at the scheduled time. And when that happened, I knew something serious was going on. And so, I left the church service, and I was discussing, the lady kept on talking about John's condition, and I was really a little confused. what the phone call was about. So I asked her, what's the purpose of the call? And she said to me, ma'am, your husband will never leave this hospital. So it was a little devastating at the moment. That was not an easy phone call to take. But at the same time, I knew I had to make a quick decision. And the Bible says that we're supposed to let the peace of God be the controlling factor in our life. And I knew that word was in my heart. And, in our church, we've had the word of God come over and over. And I saw where that foundation that had been laid in my heart of the word of God, it kept me in this day. And because of that, I was able to hear the voice of God. I didn't feel peace about what she was saying. And so I said to her, don't take him off of anything. She wanted to take him, she was trying to get permission to take him off the life support into palliative care, hospice. But God said no. And I went back in the church service. When it ended, I went up. I think it was over at the time. I went up and talked to my pastor and told her what had happened. And she had the same thing. It was not God's will for John to die.
Nancy, what you're saying is so important, because here we are sitting with your husband here, and if you would have just listened to the medical advice and then just let him go, but you heard from God. And, I think for people listening, let them be encouraged to, turn your heart to God. No matter what the report is, sometimes no matter what the doctors may say, if there's no hope, there's hope in Jesus. And what you did was you turned your heart to Jesus and you said, God, what are you saying about my husband? And God told you it's not his time to go. That's right. And here he is. That's what a powerful lesson.
Yeah. So we got through that time, but I had been waiting to get him into a long-term care facility, because at this point he'd been in ICU over 2 months in the hospital, and it's of course longer than that usually goes on, and things weren't moving with that. So I was contacting our insurance company, trying to call somebody in the hospital. Finally, we got it worked out. November 2021, John was moved to a long-term care facility near the hospital. He's still in ICU and on a ventilator. And one early evening, he fell asleep. He was starting to fall asleep, I should say. He was getting very sleepy. And I really was getting concerned. It almost seemed like he was going to sleep and not wake up. And I called our pastor again. It was actually the night we had a prayer meeting, and I was watching it. John and I both were watching it on the computer screen, and our pastor came in, and she told everybody, the devil's trying to kill John Hooper. And everybody comes to the front of the sanctuary. Everybody starts praying strong, and he woke up. It was like the story of Lazarus when Jesus said, wake up. He woke up. And, God spared his life multiple times. And there was that more stories we could tell, but we won't have time. But it gave us hope, just to see the miracles. It gave me hope to keep going. And, our church members, they prayed constantly, texted us scriptures, gave us things, came and just helped us, shoveled snow when it snowed. We didn't have to ask, but we know others in the county prayed too, and we were very grateful for those people. Our neighbor mowed our yard, for a long time, and John had a lot of friends up in Brevard and Conisty Falls. They sent gifts and multiple cards, and so it was much appreciated, and all that support really helped us get through this. And I wanted to share, there was also one person in our church that was really an inspiration to John and I. He was actually went into the hospital in April of 2020 with a severe case of COVID. He was 76 at the time, and he actually spent 73 days on the ventilator. 95 days in the hospital, and much like John, they didn't think he was going to make it, and really he was not expected to live at all, and miraculously he came through that. So he and his wife would call John. They'd encourage him to fight and cry to Jesus. His wife and daughter fought very hard for his life, and they were a big support to us, because just to see that somebody else came through this, because most people weren't.
Not putting aside any of the miracles God had done previous, but I know the one thing that came to mind was I was still in ICU, and I remember one morning the doctor came in, listened to my heart, lungs. He started to walk out. He stopped and turned around and he told my wife, he said, John's not getting any worse, but he's not getting any better. We're not a long-term facility for people on ventilators. The closest facility is in Ohio. And I mean, I just started to feel good about recovery. When he said that, it was devastating. I didn't know when they were going to move me, and I was like, I won't be able to see you for a long time. At that time, I couldn't talk, but I had a little dry erase board, and I remember writing doom and gloom on it, and I just showed my wife, and then I erased it, and I put the board down. And it was a few days after that, they moved me out of intensive care, brought me in a room, and about 2 weeks later, they came in and said, we're going to do an oxygen test to see if you can survive not being on the ventilator. The first day would be 2 hours, the next day would be 4, then 8, 16, 20, and 24. So they came in. My wife had encouraged me to sit up in my bed, take long, deep breaths. And I thought, well, I could do that for 2 hours, but I don't know how I'm going to do that for 20, and then sleep 4, and then do that for 24. I just thought, it's just, it's almost impossible. There's no way that I can do all that. But I prayed to God, and God helped me. I did the 2 hours, and when I got done, the medical staff came in, they drew some blood, they checked my oxygen, and much to their surprise, they said, you passed. Tomorrow we'll do 4. Well, we got to 20 hours. The lung doctor came in. The respiratory therapist was explaining to him what was going on. He said, don't take him and put him back on the ventilator for 4 hours. Just leave him on for the full 24 and see how he does. And much to my surprise, it was a miracle. But I passed. No more ventilator. They took it out of the room. And I had done this many times before. I never could do it. So it was a shock. It was a miracle. I mean, we were all rejoicing.
They say that we were told by respiratory therapists and the doctor that usually once somebody's on a ventilator for 2 to 3 weeks, they never come off.
And they were about to ship him to Ohio,
yes,
because they didn't keep people long-term on the ventilator.
Yes.
So how many months had you been on the ventilator when you were able to go this night and not be on it?
4 months.
4 months.
So after that, I had to go to rehab to get stronger again. I needed OT, PT, speech therapy. I had to learn to talk again. I had to learn how to move my arms. I couldn't stand for more than 3 seconds without somebody holding me. So I had to go and get some work so where I could go home and function. So I was overjoyed. I was overjoyed that, I was finally to the last phase. So I had done that. I finally got to go home. I was home for about 3 weeks, and started having lung problems again. My oxygen started dropping again. Had to go back to the hospital. I was told that my left lung had collapsed, that they were going to have to do surgery and remove the upper part of my lung and then do some work to the bottom to get it to where I could function.
And at this time, his daughter was about to graduate, and he was really looking forward to being there, and it was looking like that wasn't going to happen.
So at one time, they had announced a code, and multiple doctors, critical care doctors, came rushing into my room. My oxygen, I was on 2 liters at that time. My oxygen they would put me on 14 liters. So it was getting very serious. They came in, they determined what the problem was, and they got me to where I could get, and go have the surgery. I was finally able to go home. I made it to my daughter's graduation. Still had some medical issues, but trusting Jesus with them.
Well, we just had to encourage our heart in God during that time, as he was so excited to come home, and we had to go back to the hospital. It was very hard, for both of us after such a big victory. But we just kept crying out to Jesus, and I kept fighting for his life. Our pastor, the whole church, and others kept praying, and in the long run, it really did help. The lung surgery, like he said, they removed a lot of damage. They improved the condition of the other lung, and so overall, it was better. So we were grateful, for that. And this time he came home and stayed home. And like he said, he made it to the graduation. It was a miracle. And 7 months in the hospital, 4 months on a ventilator, 3 months in ICU. So we're grateful to Jesus. And his scripture is in one of his scriptures that he felt like God gave him was in Psalms 116. And it says, I love the Lord because he has heard and now hears my voice and my supplications. Because he has inclined his ear to me, therefore I will call upon him as long as I live. And that's what John's determined, that he's going to serve God the rest of his life. He's going to seek God. He's going to do the will of God. It says, the cords and sorrows of death were around me, and the terrors of Sheol, the place of the dead, had laid hold of me. I suffered anguish and grief, trouble and sorrow. Then I called on the name of the Lord, and that's exactly what happened. O Lord, I beseech you, save my life and deliver me. And that was his prayer. Gracious is the Lord and richly righteous. Yes, our God is merciful. The Lord preserves the simple. I was brought low, and he helped and saved me.
Yes. That is so good. And John, we just have a minute or two left. What can you tell the listeners in a minute to encourage them? There are people who are going through things that are really difficult. What can you say to them?
The only thing I can say is cry out to God. God will hear your cry, and he'll answer you. If you humble yourself and come to God, God will hear you, and he'll answer you. He loves us, and he has nothing but good things for us.
That's so good. And John, you are an absolute miracle. And I remember your daughter's graduation. I remember the prayers. We were all praying for you to be there. And here it is, your lungs are collapsing and going through all this. You're back in the hospital. But God brought you back out of the hospital. And then I remember you walking into the church where the graduation was and just seeing you coming in there. And it was just what a testimony of the power of God. And yet, for those who don't know, you could not walk for a period of time because you were so incapacitated, and you were in a wheelchair for a period of time. They weren't sure about your leg usage, but progressively I saw you, and all of a sudden there you were with a cane, and then eventually now you have no cane, you're walking, you're able to get around very quickly, you're able to drive, and it's John, you were an absolute miracle and testimony. So we're so grateful for what God did in your life. And we want to encourage you today. You may be going through some struggles. They may not be life-threatening like John went through, but whatever your struggles are, be encouraged and do what John did and Nancy, and that is that they turned their heart to God and they cried out to God. As he read in Psalms 116, that God hears our cries. When we turn to him, he will deliver you out of whatever pit you're in. So Thank you so much for listening. This is Word of Faith Fellowship radio programs. We're on this program every Sunday at 10:30 a.m. We hope that you will continue listening. We record these programs. If you want to watch them, they're videoed, and our website is www.wordoffaithfellowship.org. Thank you so much.